1799 George Washington Birthnight Banquet and Ball. Why do I love thee?
They have English country dancing.
There was so much pomp and circumstance.
The researching, the sourcing, the sewing.
Meet a lot of new people, to share our love of history and Alexandria.
And it was just like, wow, like this is where it really happened. You know, George Washington actually danced in this room, and we're still dancing in this room.
My name's Gary Oforth. I've been a volunteer here at Gadsby's Tavern since 2012. My fondest memory is that I started here as a tour guide and later found out that they have English country dancing for free on Tuesday nights, and made the mistake or the grand decision to tell Susan that they have dancing, which then dominoed into people asking me if I'm going to attend the ball, and then followed up by, are you dressing up for the ball? My fondest memory is deciding I didn't want to wear my costume from 1780 for an 1812 ball, only to find out that I looked much more out of place wearing a 21st century suit than I did a costume from 20 years before the setting of the ball.
My name is Elizabeth Keaney, and my first attendance at the Birthnight Ball was back in 2007. And I later moved around the country, but when I came back to this area in 2017, I was thrilled to join back with Gadsby's. I come to the Alexandria Assembly classes every week, and it's such a joy to meet a lot of new people, to share our love of history and Alexandria. I think, though, my very fondest memory was, again, at the 2020 ball, watching my dear friend Brian Hilton take on the role of General Washington. I've known Brian for almost 20 years, and not only is he a dear friend, he's an incredible educator, and to watch him take on a role he was born for was very exciting.
My name is Kari Labell, but you might know me better as Martha Washington. I've been playing this wonderful First Lady here for almost quarter of a century. Now, many of you may or may not know that Gadsby's asks its volunteers to portray their characters in first person. That means that we have to be able to be that person for you. As a result, I've studied Martha and researched her life for many, many years. I'm very glad that I've done that because I've been asked a lot of questions. I've been asked about her relationship with George. What did she feel about Sally Fairfax? About the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, Mount Vernon, the American Revolution, the presidency, and of course, friends and family.
The first thing that I was interested in really was the dancing, but then we got more and more into the history of the thing and how perfect it was to be doing this at Gadsby's where it really happened.
Indeed. We went from, as Jamie says, being ordinary guests to assuming roles. Some years ago, Gretchen asked me to take over as the major domo, whose principal job is to introduce the guests as they arrive, and then to give a little description of the actual historical events that took place on that very day in Alexandria. The most important thing in that job was for me that I would bring my little round gavel block, because I would, every time I introduced somebody, I'd hit the floor with my walking stick, and that would make Gretchen crazy.
Well, what I found what had the longest effect for me was when I played Eliza Law one year, when I was a good deal younger, as one of Martha Washington's grandchildren, and found out first what an amazing character she was for her time. Very liberated woman. It didn't work out too well in that era. And then learned how interesting the time period was generally in terms of the history and what was going on with George Washington and then John Adams. And that inspired a whole mystery series.
The first ball that we attended was in 1990, and we just went as regular guests. We weren't in period attire. The evening started at the Ramada Hotel. That was for cocktails and the banquet. After that, the attendees all were gathered. Some went in their own cars, some went in a special van, and they came here to Gadsby's Tavern to finish the evening with dancing and table games in the assembly room, 18th century table games. We really enjoyed ourselves. We decided, well, maybe we should start coming to these more often.
And could I interject, Rick? There was so much pomp and circumstance honoring George Washington. First Virginia was there, and there were swords drawn, and it was so impressive we wanted to participate. So the next year in 1991, as we were new members of the Colonial Cotillion, we were invited, and we were very excited. I had to borrow a dress, and Rick was able to borrow regimentals, and we attended. And
we attended as
Colonel.
No, at the time.
Oh, you were Captain.
Captain Alexander Hamilton.
And I was Eliza Hamilton, or Schuyler.
We got married 2 years later, I believe.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. But at the dais, there were all these generals, and it was just spectacular. And the demonstration dancing was wonderful. But the main thing was Colin Powell was there, and his wife Alma.
And if you recall the calendar, the year 1990, that was the 91. That was the roll-up to Desert Shield, which preceded Desert Storm. So he's a very busy guy, but he still honored Gadsby and Frank Slate by coming. And that was
He did, and
amazing.
He and Alma were lovely and took pictures with everyone, and we still have that picture, and he and Alma signed my program. It was our best event ever, and that was my favorite event.
I am Ms. Kerry McClure. I generally attend these balls as Mrs. Hannah Fairfax Washington, married to a cousin of the general's. Tonight, I'd like to share with you the biggest change that I have seen during these years that I've attended. The first ball I attended was back in 1996 or 1997. And back then, the balls were set during the Revolutionary War, with General Washington attending in his uniform and all of us fervent supporters of liberty wearing our imposing 1770s finest. Well, the 200th anniversary of the balls of 1798 and 99 were fast approaching. And those were the balls that General Washington actually attended here at Mr. Gadsby's Tavern. And so Mrs. Gretchen Bulova thought it would be a splendid idea if we could recreate those balls to celebrate their bicentennial, except one minor technicality. The finery of 1798 and 99 were vastly different than that of the 1770s. And so began the great turning of the aircraft carrier project, as Ms. Bulova later characterized it. For while I am certain that she thought this would be a fairly painless process, it took years of cajoling, pleading, reasoning to get folks most of whom had never interpreted the Regency period, to do the researching, the sourcing, the sewing, the saving the money for whole new historic wardrobes. But all those hundreds of hours of sewing paid off. And so the balls that you all have attended for the last 20 years are the result of that project. The ball set in 1799 with an older and wiser President Washington.
My name is Linda Lovell. I've been volunteering with the Birthnight Balls and attending the Birthnight Balls ever since they came back to Gadsby's Tavern Museum. So that's been several decades. And one of the main things that I have done during that time is work with the dessert collation and sometimes with the bar, being a bartender. One of my most frustrating memories and funniest memories is early on when it first came back, when the Birthnight Ball first came back to Gadsby's. It was decided that the main focus of the collation would be appropriately the birthday cake for George Washington. And it was decided that the recipe would be the one in which Martha Washington used to make her great cakes. When it came time with George Washington standing in front of me to cut the cake, it would not slice. It simply was too thick. I was actually shaking trying to cut the cake. It was, for some reason, and I was much, much younger then, so it's not old ladies trying to cut, it was. And we actually summoned a waiter from the restaurant. He could not cut the cake. He actually ended up trying to stab the cake, which did not make for a nice scene in front of His Excellency, Mr. Washington. So for that particular birthnight ball, we did not have a cake, or we did not eat the cake, let me put it that way.
My name is Jeanne DeFliese. I'm a lifetime member of Gadsby's Tavern Museum Society and a longtime attendee of the Birthnight Ball. I think the first year my husband and I came to the ball was probably 2006. So we've been to many Birthnight Balls over the years and enjoyed so many of them. One of my fondest memories of coming to the ball probably had to be one of the first ones we attended because of the great people we got to meet. One of my favorite people that I met was Ernie. Ernie was the Major Duomo for the event, I know, for many years even before we started attending. And we had the pleasure of dining with Ernie that night at the restaurant for dinner. And he was just so charming and enchanting and added, so much to the event for us. Having Corky and Cindy Palmer as our dance master and mistress, getting everybody together, laughing, having a couple of drinks, enjoying a great meal, enjoying that fabulous little hedgehog on the dessert table at the end of the evening with his little tricorn hat was always a highlight.
My name is Susan Enos. I've been a volunteer in Old Town Alexandria for about 10 years. I remember my very first ball about 10 years ago. When I heard about balls here at Gadsby's, I came in a costume, not in historic clothing. But I remember sitting at the end of the ballroom and looking across the length of the ballroom, listening to the violinist and the horn player, the music just wafting above a crowd of people all in period clothing, right down to the children, and sitting in the room where George Washington actually had his birthnight balls. And I thought, wow, this is about as close as a 21st century person is going to come to seeing what an actual assembly would look like.
It is all about the local history in Alexandria and the cherished relationship with General and later President Washington. This 6-hour event, where most attendees are attired in 1790s raiment, vibrantly brings to life the many connections that this great man had with Alexandria, its citizens, and nearby neighbors. An acknowledgement of his many accomplishments in war, in peace, and always in the service of his country, which he was so critical in establishing. We Alexandrians can take supreme pride in our relationship with GW and Lady Washington, with their proximity from Mount Vernon to our and their city. I have been involved in some of the most wonderful living history events, but this evening is always the gold standard, and this would be my 40th straight. This celebration of Washington has so many layers. A ball with exquisite dancing, a banqueting supper, a cocktail reception, a fine dessert collation, a bit of period gaming. In the most elegant of historical settings, Gadsby's Tavern, Museum, and Restaurant. A toast to General and Lady Washington. Huzzah.